I wrote the ultimatum myself. That is the part I return to when I try to understand how it happened. Not the silence that followed. Not the arithmetic of the losses. Not the final compliance report, which I filed alone in a room that had held 47 officers at the campaign's opening and held only me at its close. I return to the moment of the writing, because I want to find the error. I want to locate the exact line where the logic failed. I have read that document 700 times in the years since the campaign ended, and I have never found it. The logic did not fail. The document was correct in every particular. That is the part I cannot put down. The Pale Dominion does not make war. I want to be clear about this, because the record has been confused by those who were not present and who did not understand what the campaign was. We do not make war. War is a negotiation by other means, and negotiation implies uncertainty about the outcome. The Pale Dominion does not operate in conditions of uncertainty. We issue compliance directives. We dispatch compliance fleets. The species receiving the directive either complies or does not comply, and if it does not comply, the compliance fleet resolves the non-compliance. This has happened 411 times in Pale Dominion history. 411 compliance campaigns. The outcomes are not evenly distributed, but they are entirely consistent. The Pale Dominion has never failed to achieve compliance. We achieve compliance through numbers. This is the doctrine's core logic, and it is simple enough that I can state it plainly. Any sufficiently large force cannot be overcome by any insufficiently large force. The Pale Dominion's compliance fleets are always sufficiently large. We have been doing this for 800 years. We know exactly how large sufficiently is. We know the ratios. We know the margin calculations. We know how many vessels must be dispatched to a given system to make resistance not merely futile, but structurally impossible, to make the arithmetic of resistance so clearly wrong that the species receiving the directive understands, at first scan, that non-compliance is not an option they can afford. It works because of what it looks like from the receiving end. You are a civilization with, say, 300 warships. You receive the Pale Dominion's compliance directive. 12 hours later, you detect 800 Dominion compliance vessels entering your outer system. You do not fight, you comply. Not because you are weak, not because you lack courage, but because you can count. You know what 800 vessels against 300 means. You know that the Pale Dominion has done this 400 times before, and that the compliance rate, after the fleet arrives and the scan is completed, is essentially absolute. You comply because the math tells you to comply. The compliance fleet for the human border systems was not 800 vessels. We had good intelligence on the human military disposition, and we had run the margin calculations with care. The human species had, at the time of the campaign's planning, approximately 9,000 warships distributed across a volume of space that gave us 47 points of simultaneous approach. We intended to hit all 47 simultaneously. No communication between the systems, no ability to coordinate a response, no time to reposition assets from one threatened point to another. Each compliance fleet was calibrated to the asset density of its assigned system. The smallest was 300 vessels. The largest was 1,400. The total force committed to the campaign was 41,216 vessels, against 9,000 human warships distributed across 47 separate systems. The margin was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. By every calculation we had ever run, in every form of warfare we had ever studied, a force of 41,000 vessels against 9,000 vessels distributed across 47 separate systems, unable to concentrate, unable to communicate in time to matter, was not a war. It was a compliance action. It was a demonstration that resistance was structurally impossible, followed by the delivery of the compliance directive's terms. I wrote the document. I reviewed the margin calculations. I signed the operational order. I dispatched 47 fleet commanders with their assignments and their expected timelines and their reporting protocols. I took my position in the Strategic Compliance Command tier, and I waited for the first confirmation of contact. I am going to tell you what I remember, not what the operational record shows. The operational record is largely silence, which is not a useful document. But what I personally witnessed, from my position in the command tier, across the 830 hours between the campaign's initiation and its formal closure, the first contact reports came in on schedule. 47 systems, 47 compliance fleets, 47 approach vectors, all coordinated to a common initiation window. The reports were supposed to arrive in 2 waves. First, a contact transmission sent the moment each fleet achieved stable approach and initial scan of its target system. Second, a compliance-achieved transmission sent the moment the target species acknowledged the directive and stood down. Between the first transmission and the second, for a species with any reasonable military capacity, the expected interval was between 48 and 96 hours. For a species that chose to contest before ultimately complying, the expected interval stretched to as much as 300 hours. We had seen both. We had margin calculations for both. The contact transmissions came in, all 47 of them, within the initiation window. The fleet commanders reported their positions, their approach vectors, their initial scan data on the target systems. All 47 systems showed human military assets within the expected ranges. All 47 fleet commanders reported nominal approach conditions. The campaign was proceeding as planned. Then we waited for the second wave. The compliance-achieved transmissions from the first 8 systems came in between 50 and 80 hours after contact confirmation. Smooth, orderly, 8 species, 8 compliance-achieved reports, 8 sets of fleet commanders confirming that their targets had received the directive, scanned the approach force, and stood down. Normal, expected. The Pale Dominion's compliance doctrine operating exactly as it had operated for 800 years. Then the reports stopped, not all at once. That would have been alarming in a way I could have categorized. They stopped one at a time, over the course of the next 200 hours, with intervals between the stoppages that made each individual absence easy to attribute to something benign. A relay malfunction, a transmission timing discrepancy, a fleet commander prioritizing the compliance action on the ground over the reporting protocol. We had seen all of these before. Each individual absence was explainable. The pattern that emerged from 47 individual absences was something I did not have a category for. By the time I began to understand that the absences were not individual but systemic, 31 compliance fleets had gone silent. 31. I want to be precise about what this means, because gone silent sounds like a technical problem, a relay network failure, a jamming operation, something fixable. 31 compliance fleets gone silent means 31 separate fleet command structures, each with its own communications, staff, its own relay network, its own backup transmission protocols, had all, simultaneously, failed to produce a single transmission in the reporting window. The probability of 31 simultaneous relay failures across 31 separate communications architectures, covering a volume of space that no single jamming system could have blanketed, was not something our probability models could accommodate. The models produced a number that was effectively 0. It was so close to 0 that the model flagged it as a calculation error and asked me to confirm the inputs. I confirmed the inputs. The number remained effectively 0. By the time I began dispatching courier vessels to the 31 silent systems, 39 compliance fleets had gone silent. The couriers found nothing. I want to be precise about this too. Not the remains of a battle. Not the signature of a weapons engagement. Not the wreckage of compliance fleet vessels drifting in the approach corridors. Nothing. The systems were quiet. The expected human military assets were not in evidence. The compliance fleet was not in evidence. The void read as empty, in the way a void reads as empty when nothing has ever happened there. No residual heat bloom, no debris scatter, no ionization trail from a weapons exchange. This was the data that made me go cold. Destruction leaves evidence. Even a complete and total annihilation of a fleet leaves the residue of what the annihilation cost. Wreckage. Weapons discharge signatures. The thermal bloom of a battle fought, even a brief one. None of this was present. The systems were quiet in a way that suggested not that a battle had been fought and won, but that the compliance fleets had simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next, without expending any measurable energy in the process. There was a meeting, in the 300th hour, among the senior officers who remained in the command tier. I called it, because the protocol demanded it, a compliance action that has exceeded 200 hours without compliance achieved transmissions from more than 60% of its fleet assignments requires a senior review. I had run those reviews before, on 3 other campaigns. The other 3 had all been campaigns against species with significant military capacity, and the reviews had produced the same outcome each time, a recommendation to increase the force commitment in the contested zones and to extend the compliance window. More ships, more time, same outcome. I opened the review meeting and presented the current status display. 29 approach vectors in red, 7 in amber. The 11 gold compliance achieved vectors from the first wave species. Everyone in the room could see the display. Everyone in the room had been watching the display for 300 hours. The review was not going to tell them anything the display had not already told them. The first thing that came out of the review was what I had expected. A recommendation from the Fleet Disposition Officer to reinforce the silent corridors. Send additional compliance fleets to the zones where the originals had gone dark. Higher force concentration. Break whatever communications or jamming capability was suppressing transmission relays. The second thing that came out of the review was what I had not expected. A recommendation from the Survey Intelligence Officer to re-examine the pre-campaign sweep data for the transit corridors. He did not say why. He said it carefully, the way a precise person says something that they are not entirely sure about. He said that he had been reviewing the sweep data as a matter of routine and had noticed a pattern in the distribution of the classified objects that he wanted to examine more closely. He said he was not making a finding, only a recommendation to look again. I assigned him to the task. I did not reinforce the silent corridors. I told the Fleet Disposition Officer that I wanted the survey re-examination completed before I committed additional vessels to approach vectors where I did not yet understand what was happening to the vessels already deployed. He recorded an objection. The objection is in the operational log. I countersigned it and held the decision. In the 318th hour, the Survey Intelligence Officer brought me his findings. He laid them out on the display in the conference room, adjacent to the command tier, with the approach vector map overlaid on the survey classification data. And he walked me through the distribution of the 12 classified objects. He showed me their positions. He showed me which approach vectors they intersected. He showed me, vector by vector, which compliance fleets had been routed through which classified object positions. Then he showed me the correlation. Every approach vector that had produced a red status indicator on the command tier display intersected with at least one classified object position. Every approach vector that had produced a gold compliance achieved indicator did not intersect with any classified object position. The 8 compliance species fleets had been routed through clean transit corridors with no classified objects in their paths. The 39 corridor-routed fleets had been routed through the border corridor, which contained the 36-kilometer hull. The second zone fleets had been routed through their own approach lane, which contained several of the other 11 classified objects. The correlation was complete, 100%, no exceptions. I looked at the display for a long time. The Survey Intelligence Officer did not say anything. He had said what needed to be said, and he understood that I needed time to look at it. What I was looking at was this. We had dispatched compliance fleets through 12 positions that our survey had classified as containing derelict, non-functional, insufficient threat objects. Every fleet that had transited through one of these positions had gone silent. Every fleet that had not transited through one of these positions had achieved compliance or was still active. The intelligence classification was the error. That was the only interpretation that fit the data. The 12 classified objects were not derelicts. They were the reason the 39 corridor fleets and the 8 second zone fleets had gone dark. I did not yet know what they were, specifically, but the correlation was complete, and a complete correlation in a dataset that large is not a coincidence. I asked the Survey Intelligence Officer one question. What was the basis for the original classification? He answered without hesitation, because he had already looked this up. The basis was the absence of an active power signature. All 12 objects had been surveyed by the pre-campaign sweep, and all 12 had shown no detectable power output above the noise floor of the survey instruments. A vessel with no detectable power output cannot be operational. Therefore, a vessel with no detectable power output is not operational. Therefore, it is a derelict. I asked him whether the survey instruments were capable of detecting a vessel that was operational, but running below the instrument's noise floor. He was a precise person. He said, no. It was the 40th Compliance Fleet silence that made me begin reviewing the archive record for the border corridor. The border corridor was not a system. It was the space between systems, a volume of transited space through which the compliance fleets, the campaign's second and third zones had all been required to route, a corridor of approach. We had surveyed it in the pre-campaign intelligence sweep. The sweep had found one object of note, A human vessel, approximately 36 kilometers in length, no active power signature, no response to hailing, no detectable internal atmosphere, hull substantially compromised along its forward port quarter. The intelligence assessment had classified it as a derelict, non-functional, insufficient threat. The compliance fleets routed through the corridor without adjustment. I read the intelligence assessment 4 times before I understood what I was looking at. The classification was non-functional. The basis for this classification was the absence of an active power signature. The hull was categorized as dead because dead hulls do not emit power. This is correct. Dead hulls do not emit power. The assessment had not addressed whether a hull could be dead and also occupied. It had not addressed whether a hull with no active power signature could have passive systems, detection systems, waiting systems, systems that drew no measurable power because they were not active, but merely patient. It had not addressed whether 36 kilometers of human warship construction, classified as a derelict in a border corridor, might be something other than what it appeared to be from the outside. It had not addressed these things because the Pale Dominion's compliance doctrine had been built across 400 campaigns against species that did not do things this way. You do not understand a category error until you have already been destroyed by it. I need to be careful here about what I can claim to know and what I am inferring from the silence. I did not watch the engagements. No one from the Pale Dominion watched the engagements. This is part of what I am still accounting for. Years after the campaign's closure, I know the outcome and I know the evidence, but I did not see the mechanism. What I have is a record of absences, and what I have reconstructed from those absences is a sequence that I believe to be accurate, though I cannot prove it to the granularity a full operational record would provide. The corridor scan data took 4 days to transmit from the courier positions to the command tiers receiving arrays. We received it in the 502nd hour. The senior technical analyst who processed it was a woman who had worked in the strategic compliance command tier for 22 years. She had processed incoming scan data from 360 compliance campaigns. I have never seen her expression go the way it went when she reviewed the corridor scan data. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she asked if she could run the analysis twice before presenting findings, because she wanted to confirm the numbers independently. I told her to take what time she needed. She ran it twice. She presented the findings 3 hours later in the conference room with the approach vector display, and she stated the numbers in the flat tone of a person who has decided that the only way through a finding like this is to present it without inflection and let the listeners reach their own conclusions about what the numbers mean. The weapon's discharge signature was consistent with a sustained engagement across the full corridor approach arc. Duration of engagement, inferred from the residual ionization gradient, approximately 406 hours. Rate of discharge, inferred from the thermal decay profile, continuous, with periodic intensity spikes consistent with multiple target engagement. Area of engagement coverage, the full corridor transit zone, from the outer detection threshold at 900,000 kilometers to the inner engagement boundary at approximately 12,000 kilometers. 406 hours of sustained weapons discharge from a single point source. Across that 406 hours, 32,000 compliance vessels had transited the corridor. The analyst presented a secondary finding. The discharge intensity data showed no significant decrease in discharge rate between the first transiting fleet and the 39th. The rate at the end of the engagement was within 4% of the rate at the beginning. The hull had not degraded its weapons output over 406 hours of continuous engagement against 32,000 vessels. I asked her about the hull's damage profile. She presented the courier scan data showing hull integrity above 90%. She noted that the surface signature of the hull's forward port quarter, the damage that the pre-campaign survey had identified as evidence of derelict status, appeared at courier scan resolution to be consistent with cosmetic surface damage rather than structural compromise. Old scoring, the kind of marking a hull accumulates from long operation, not the kind that comes from recent combat. What I understood from this: the hull had engaged 39 compliance fleets across 406 hours, and the engagement had not cost it anything it had not already spent before the campaign began. What I believe happened: the compliance fleets routed through the border corridor one at a time, separated by the operational windows that their approach timelines required. They transited through the volume of space that contained the classified derelict. They did not scan the derelict with any particular attention because the intelligence assessment had already classified it, and compliance fleet commanders do not rescan classified objects on approach. The scan was done, the object was categorized, the corridor was cleared. The hull was not a derelict. I do not know when it activated. I do not know what its crew complement was, or whether it had a crew in the conventional sense, or whether the activation was triggered by some threshold the transiting compliance fleets crossed. A number of vessels, a proximity, a combination of sensor returns that matched a pre-programmed condition. I know that the compliance fleets went into the corridor and did not come out. I know that the corridor's residual signature, when the couriers eventually reached it and scanned it at sufficient resolution, showed evidence of weapons discharge on a scale that made the Pale Dominion's analyst go quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of confusion, but the quiet of people who have just received a number that they do not know how to process. The weapon's discharge signature was consistent with a single hull engaging multiple targets across a wide approach arc, not multiple hulls. 1. The discharge pattern did not suggest a fleet engagement. It suggested a culling, methodical, directional, covering the corridor approach vectors in sequence. The compliance fleets had come through the corridor in waves, separated by hours, and the hull had engaged each wave in turn. 39 compliance fleets. 39 fleets, ranging from 300 to 1,400 vessels each, processed through the border corridor over the course of 412 hours, and the hull had engaged every one of them. The compliance fleets had weapons. They would have returned fire. The hull's hull integrity, based on the courier scans of the corridor, showed no evidence of significant impact damage along its primary structure. The forward port quarter compromise that the intelligence assessment had noted as evidence of the hull being a derelict was exactly what it had been, assessed as old damage, pre-existing, not combat current. The hull had not taken new damage in the corridor. 39 compliance fleets, 1 hull. No new damage. I have had years to sit with this number, and it does not become easier. The sheer scale of what the weapon's discharge signature implied is something I have had to approach sideways, the way you approach a light source that is too bright to look at directly. 39 fleets. Collectively, across those 39 fleets, we had dispatched approximately 32,000 vessels through the border corridor. 32,000 vessels, deployed in waves, with the weapons complement and the crew capacity, and the combat coordination that 32,000 Pale Dominion compliance vessels represent, against 1 hull. The hull was still in the corridor when the couriers found it. It had not moved. It was sitting in the same position the intelligence assessment had recorded it in, bearing the same approach vector, showing no active power signature. The couriers scanned it at close range and got exactly what the pre-campaign sweep had gotten. 36 kilometers of apparently inert human construction, with the hull compromise in the forward port quarter that the intelligence assessment had noted, and no detectable internal atmosphere, and no response to hailing. The couriers transmitted the scan data home and then, on my direct order, changed their approach vector and left the corridor without attempting to close on the hull. I gave that order in the 43rd hour of my reviewing the corridor scan data, 3 days after the couriers had transmitted it, in a command tier that by then held 11 officers instead of the 47 who had stood in it at the campaign's opening. The others were not dead. They had simply reached the limits of what they could professionally tolerate and had requested reassignment or leave. I had approved every request. There is no doctrine for what we were looking at, and there is no training for the kind of sustained, quiet, methodical erasure of a force that we had assembled with every margin calculation we had ever developed. The 39th Fleet's silence was the last fleet silence I recorded for 3 days, because the 39th Fleet had been the last compliance fleet still transiting the border corridor. The remaining 8 fleets had been assigned to systems that routed through a different approach vector. Not the corridor, but a second zone of transit that the campaign's planning documents had treated as a separate approach lane. These 8 fleets had achieved their contact confirmations on schedule and then gone silent in the same way the others had gone silent, and their systems showed the same empty quiet when the couriers reached them. These 8 systems did not have a border corridor. They had different approach geometries entirely. They had no pre-classified derelict. I re-examined the broader survey data. not just the border corridor. Every system in the approach envelope that the campaign's compliance fleets had transited or passed near. This took time. The pre-campaign survey covered a volume of space that required approximately 40 hours to review at the analytical depth the situation now demanded. I assigned 4 survey analysts to the task, and I reviewed their work personally as they produced it. We were looking for objects that fit the same profile as the 12 already identified. Large, quiet, positioned in or near transit corridors. Classified as non-functional. The analysts found the 12. Then they found the same 12 again, confirming the previous identification. They did not find additional objects. What they found instead was something subtler. Within the survey data, there were 11 positions where the instruments had recorded what the data flagged as ambient sensor noise. Readings that were slightly elevated, above the baseline noise floor of the survey sweep, but below the threshold that would trigger a formal classification event. The survey software had filtered these out automatically as instrumental artifact. The analysts had not reviewed them in the pre-campaign sweep, because there was nothing to review. The software had already determined they were not real contacts. The analyst who found this, on her second pass through the raw data, brought it to me without comment. She laid the positions on the approach vector display alongside the 12 confirmed classified objects. The 11 noise floor readings were distributed across approach vectors that none of the 47 compliance fleets had used. They were on vectors we had not routed anyone through. I looked at the display for a long time. The 12 classified objects had produced complete, 100% correlated outcomes across every compliance fleet routed through them. The 11 noise floor readings were in positions that no compliance fleet had approached, so we had no correlation data. We did not know if they were instrumental artifact. We did not know if they were something that our survey instruments had detected at the very edge of their sensitivity range and had then automatically filtered out. We did not know if they were 12 additional hulls running at a power level below the survey noise floor in approach corridors we had not used, waiting. We did not know. 11 objects classified as derelict, non-functional, insufficient threat, distributed across the approach envelope in positions that, with the campaign behind me and the silence of 39 corridor-routed fleets in my memory, no longer looked like a coincidental distribution of abandoned human vessels. They looked like a network, a distributed set of positions chosen to cover every viable approach vector to the human-occupied systems. 11 objects besides the border corridor hull, positioned. I went back to the survey data 3 times to confirm this. Positioned in the transit lanes that the 8 fleets in the second zone had used. 11 additional derelicts. 8 additional silent fleets. The Pale Dominion had conducted a compliance campaign against 47 species simultaneously. We had dispatched 47 fleets. 39 of those fleets had transited the border corridor. 8 had transited the second zone. The 8 fleets in the second zone had been distributed across a volume of space large enough to require transit through several of the 11 additional survey objects. The survey data was not precise enough, after the fact, to tell me with certainty which fleet had engaged which object. What the data told me, with the same quiet certainty that the corridor scan data had told me, was that the 8 second zone fleets had encountered something in their approach lanes that the campaign's planning had not accounted for, and that the survey's classification system had not recognized. The human species had positioned what appeared to be dead hulls across every viable approach vector to their occupied systems, not one hull, not one border corridor, a network of hulls, distributed, patient, drawing no power that our survey instruments could detect, classified by our intelligence sweep as derelicts, and disregarded accordingly. I spent 11 hours with this data before I was willing to put a number on what it implied. The border corridor hull had engaged 32,000 vessels across 39 fleet deployments without taking new damage. The remaining 11 positions had collectively accounted for the 8 second zone fleets, a further 9,000 vessels approximately. The campaign had dispatched 41,216 compliance vessels. The final count of vessels that had reached their target systems and achieved contact confirmation before going silent was 8. The 8 species that had complied without contest in the first wave before the pattern began. 8 out of 47 compliance actions resolved as expected. 39 out of 47 compliance actions resolved in silence. against a classification of objects that our survey had determined were not threats. The total losses in the campaign, 41,216 compliance vessels, less the 8 fleets that had achieved compliance confirmation. The 8 compliant fleets were recalled successfully. Total recalled vessels, approximately 6,900. Total losses, approximately 34,300 vessels, against 12 classified derelicts. I filed the compliance report. I am required by Pale Dominion Administrative Protocol to file a compliance report at the conclusion of every campaign, regardless of outcome. I have filed 411 compliance reports across my career. This was the 412th. I sat with the document for a long time before I wrote the outcome field. Before I wrote the outcome field, I sat with the loss count for 1 full day. I want to say this plainly, because it is the part that the official record does not reflect. The official record contains numbers. Numbers of vessels committed. Numbers of vessels recalled. Numbers of vessels that did not report after contact confirmation. The record does not contain what it felt like to hold those numbers across a full day before entering them into the document. 34,302 vessels. This is the count I arrived at. 6,914 recalled from the 8 compliant species fleets. 41,216 committed. The arithmetic is straightforward. 34,302 vessels that contacted their assigned systems and did not report back. Each compliance vessel in the Pale Dominion's fleet carries between 40 and 200 crew, depending on vessel class. The compliance fleet composition for this campaign ran approximately 60% medium-class vessels and 40% heavy class, with a mean crew complement of approximately 90. 34,000 vessels at 90 crew per vessel. I did not write that number in the compliance report. The compliance report tracks vessels, not crew. This is standard administrative practice. It is how we have always done it. But I wrote the number down on a separate document, privately, and I looked at it for a while, and then I put the document in my personal archive, where it will not be part of the operational record, but where I will know it is there. Then I wrote the outcome field. The outcome field in a Pale Dominion compliance report has 4 possible entries: compliance achieved, compliance pending, resistance suppressed, and campaign suspended. We have never used campaign suspended. I have reviewed the archival records going back 800 years, and there is not a single instance of campaign suspended in any compliance report filed by any Pale Dominion officer. The field exists in the form. It was presumably put there by someone who thought it was possible. Until this campaign, it had not been. I typed campaign suspended. Then I sat for a while and thought about what I wanted to say in the narrative field. The narrative field is optional. Most compliance reports do not have a narrative entry. The outcome and the supporting to speak for themselves, and Pale Dominion officers are not in the habit of editorializing. I have filed detailed narrative entries in perhaps 6 of my 412 reports. This one needed one. I wrote it carefully. I wrote it as a technical document, because the Strategic Compliance Command Tier is not a placer of emotional language, and because the people who would read this report would not be served by emotional language. I described the survey classification error. I described the distribution of the classified objects across the approach vectors. I described the corridor scan data, and the weapon's discharge signature, and the absence of new damage on the border corridor hull. I described the 8-second zone fleet approaches, and the 11 additional survey objects. I described the final count. Then I wrote one additional paragraph that I want to reproduce here, because I think it is the most honest thing I have written in 40 years of compliance work. The paragraph read as follows. The Pale Dominion's compliance doctrine is built on the assumption that sufficiently large numbers cannot be overcome by insufficiently large numbers. This assumption has been validated by 411 compliance campaigns. The current campaign suggests that this assumption has a boundary condition that was not previously identified. The boundary condition is, the doctrine functions against species whose warships are where they appear to be, and whose threat presents as their threat appears to present. Against species whose warships appear to be dead hulls in transit corridors, the doctrine fails to calculate correctly, because the input data is wrong before the calculation begins. The Pale Dominion's margin calculations are accurate. The survey classification system is not. I closed the report and transmitted it to the Administrative Compliance Bureau. Then I sat in the command tier for a while, with the operational displays still showing the 47 approach vectors and the 47 fleet assignments and the 47 contact confirmation timestamps, and the silence where the compliance achieved transmissions should have been. I want to tell you something about the hull specifically, because I think this is the detail the record does not adequately convey. The border corridor hull was 36 kilometers long. This is a number that our survey instruments measured with precision, and 36 kilometers is a number that sounds large in the abstract, but that becomes something else when you think about what it means in the context of the corridor approach geometry. A compliance fleet transiting the border corridor would have detected the hull at a range of approximately 900,000 kilometers, roughly standard scanner range for a vessel of that size at rest, with no active power signature. At 900,000 kilometers, a 36-kilometer hull registers as a point source in most scanner architectures. It resolves as a shape at shorter ranges. At 300,000 kilometers, a scanner can begin to identify hull geometry and approximate length. 32,000 compliance vessels, in 39 separate fleet waves, passed through a scanner range where the hull should have resolved as a shape. The survey classification had told them it was a derelict. Fleet commanders on approach do not rescan classified objects. They have other priorities. They are managing approach vectors and formation geometries and communication protocols, and the dozens of operational concerns that come with transiting a zone with 32,000 vessels across multiple wave deployments. But, at some point in each fleet's approach, the hull would have resolved. It would have filled their long-range scanners as something other than a point source. 36 kilometers is not subtle. At close approach range, in the border corridor geometry, it would have been visible against the corridor's star field in a way that a scanner does not adequately convey, the way a mountain does not convey adequately in a topographic description, but becomes something different when you are standing at its base looking up. I do not know if any of the compliance fleet commanders recognized, in those final moments before engagement, that the object they had classified as a derelict was not behaving as a derelict behaves. I do not know if there was a last-moment transmission that was intercepted or jammed before it could reach us. The corridor scan data covers a time window that begins after the engagements, and does not include the engagement itself. The weapon's discharge signature is what the corridor read like after, not during. What I know is that no transmission from any of the 39 corridor routed compliance fleets reached the command tier after their contact confirmations. Whatever they saw in those final moments, they did not have time to tell us about it. This is the thing I think about most in the years since the campaign closed. Not the number, not the ratio, not the classified derelict network or the precision of the approach vector coverage or the cold expertise of a 12-hull, distributed engagement across 41,000 vessels. I think about the 39 compliance fleet commanders, each in their own final moment of approach, with the 36-kilometer hull resolving on their scanner, in the way something that size resolves on a scanner, and the compliance classification telling them it was a derelict, and whatever it was they understood in the last seconds, before the hull demonstrated what it was. The Pale Dominion will not send a 48th compliance fleet. I want to be precise about why. Not because the Strategic Compliance Command Tier has issued a formal restraint order, though it has, and I countersigned it, and it will hold for as long as the current administration holds. The restraint is formal and administrative and binding. But the deeper reason, the one that I think will outlast any administrative order, is simpler. We do not know how many hulls there are. We classified 12. The network we identified covered 47 approach vectors. But the survey data we used to identify those 12 was the same survey data that classified them as derelicts in the first place. If the survey data was wrong about their status, and it was demonstrably, catastrophically wrong, then the survey data may also be wrong about their number. There may be 12. There may be 20. There may be a number that the survey data simply has no category for, because the survey instruments were not designed to find things that look like nothing. We do not know. This uncertainty is not something the Pale Dominion's compliance doctrine can calculate around. The doctrine requires accurate input data. The input data is compromised. A compliance force dispatched against an enemy whose warship count and disposition are unknown to the dispatching force is not a compliance force. It is a fleet being sent into a volume of space where something waits that may or may not be there, in a number that may or may not be what the survey says it is, with weapons and endurance characteristics that we now know are outside the parameters the doctrine was built to handle. We will not send a 48th Fleet. The courier vessels that reached the border corridor and conducted the close-range scan of the hull transmitted their data and changed their approach. Vectors on my order and left. I did not order them to hail the hull, or to transmit the compliance directive, or to do anything that might be construed as a reopening of the compliance action. I ordered them to scan and to leave. They did both. The hull was still there when they left, still in the same position, still showing no active power signature, still not responding to hailing frequencies, still presenting as exactly what the survey had classified it as: a derelict, non-functional, insufficient threat. The scan data showed that it was not a derelict. The scan data showed hull integrity above 90% across primary, structure, engine core residual temperature, consistent with a vessel that had been operational within the past 120 hours, not the years of dormancy the original survey classification implied. Weapons array geometry that the Pale Dominion's intelligence analysts had never encountered in any human vessel documentation in the archive. Not because the archive lacked human vessel data, but because the hull's weapons array was a configuration that did not appear in any record we had of human military construction. The analysts spent a long time on this last point before one of them produced the obvious explanation, which was that the archive's human military construction data had been compiled before the campaign, before we knew what we were looking at. It is possible, the analyst put it carefully because she was a precise person who did not overstate conclusions. It is possible that the hull's weapons configuration is not unusual among human military construction. It is possible that the archive simply does not have the correct data about what human warships look like when they are operational. We had 411 compliance campaigns worth of archive data on species, disposition, and military capacity. We had calibrated the margin calculations against 411 datasets. The human dataset had been compiled from external observation and intercepted transmissions and survey sweeps, which is how we compile all of our pre-campaign data. It had told us that the human species had approximately 9,000 warships. It had told us that those warships were distributed across 47 occupied systems. It had told us that there were 12 derelict hulls in the approach corridors, insufficient threat, non-functional. The dataset had not told us that the derelict hulls were the warships. I have thought about this for years. The sequence of conclusions that would have led the Pale Dominion's pre-campaign intelligence to classify the 12 corridor hulls as derelicts is entirely clear to me now, in retrospect, and it is not a sequence built on incompetence or carelessness. It is a sequence built on a model that had worked 411 times, applied to a dataset that did not fit the model. A hull with no active power signature in a transit corridor, with hull damage visible on external scan, is a derelict. This is what a derelict looks like. This is how the category works. The model classified the hull correctly according to its own terms. The model's terms were wrong. The human species, or whoever made the decision about how to position their warships, had chosen to make their warships look exactly like the thing that our survey instruments would classify as not worth worrying about. It is possible this was a deliberate strategy, that they understood how the Pale Dominion's survey classification worked and positioned their hulls accordingly. It is possible it was coincidental, that the hulls looked dead because they had chosen to run dark, and the look of a dead hull was simply what a dark hull looked like. I do not know which interpretation is correct, and I have stopped trying to determine it, because neither interpretation changes the outcome, and both interpretations lead me to the same conclusion about the 48th Compliance Fleet. There will not be a 48th Compliance Fleet. In the years since the campaign closed, I have been asked, by younger officers in the Strategic Compliance Command Tier, who were not present for any of it, what the campaign felt like from the inside. They ask this with the particular curiosity of people who did not experience a thing and want to understand it without having to experience it, which is a reasonable desire. I have tried to answer honestly, what it felt like, from the inside, was a very long wait between transmissions that did not arrive. This is not the dramatic answer they are looking for. They want to know about the moment of realization, the turn in which the command tier understood what was happening, and what it meant. There was not a single such moment. There was a sequence of moments, each individually small, each individually explainable, that accumulated into a weight that could not be explained. The 32nd fleet going silent could be a relay problem. The 33rd could be the same relay problem, propagating. The 34th began to see something else. By the 37th, there was no longer any category in the Pale Dominion's compliance doctrine for what the command tier was experiencing. But we were still in the command tier, doing our work, because there was still work to do, and the work was still proceeding on its own terms, regardless of whether we had a category for what was happening. What I remember most clearly, from the interior of those 830 hours, is the operational displays. The displays showed 47 approach vectors. Each vector had a status indicator: green for active and reporting, amber for overdue on the reporting cycle, red for silent beyond acceptable parameters. In the first days, the display was almost entirely green. The 8 species that complied early went from green to gold. The compliance achieved designation. And those 8 gold indicators were, for a few hours, a source of straightforward professional satisfaction. We were doing our work. The campaign was proceeding. The amber indicators began appearing on the second day, individual, scattered, not alarming in themselves. Amber is normal in a complex multi-system campaign. Amber means a fleet is behind its reporting schedule. Amber means a transmission missed a relay window. Amber is the normal color of a campaign that is going exactly as expected, because campaigns always have timing variations. The amber indicators did not turn gold, they turned red, not all at once, one at a time, over 200 hours, each individual red indicator appearing with its own timestamp and its own gap since last transmission and its own suite of possible explanations that became progressively less plausible, as each new red indicator appeared alongside the existing ones. By the time the display was half red, the command tier had stopped talking. I do not mean this metaphorically. I mean that the 47 officers in the command tier, who had been a professionally active presence at the start of the campaign, had become progressively quieter as the red indicators accumulated, and by the time 30 of the 47 vectors had gone red, the command tier was silent in the particular way that a room full of people who have run out of explanations go silent. I was the senior officer. It was my campaign. I kept working. I kept working because there was still work to do. There were still courier deployments to manage, and survey data to review, and incoming scan transmissions to process. The administrative function of the campaign continued even as the campaign itself became something I did not have a doctrine for. I kept the displays up. I kept the status indicators running. I kept logging the timestamps on every incoming transmission and every outdue reporting window. I kept the record. Because when this was over, and it was going to be over at some point in one way or another, there was going to need to be a record, and the record was going to need to be accurate. The display went fully red on the 519th hour. 47 approach vectors. 47 status indicators. The 8 gold compliance achieved vectors in one cluster on the display. The remaining 39 in red. Plus the separate tracking display for the second zone, where the 8 second zone fleets had gone similarly dark. I stood in front of the display for a long time. The hull was still in the corridor. The couriers had confirmed it. It had not moved. It had not transmitted. It had not, so far as our instruments could determine, done anything since the engagements ended except sit in the same position it had occupied before the campaign began, showing no active power signature, presenting as exactly the thing our survey had classified it as. I thought about sending a final courier to transmit the compliance directive again. The directive had never technically been delivered. The compliance fleets had been dispatched to deliver it, and they had not arrived. I could transmit the directive directly from the command tier, bypassing the fleet delivery mechanism. It was within protocol. It was the next logical step in a compliance action where the fleet delivery mechanism had failed. I did not send the directive. I did not send it because the directive's logic assumed that the receiving party had not already received sufficient information about the Pale Dominion's compliance doctrine to understand what the directive represented. The hull in the corridor, or whoever commanded it, or whoever had positioned it there, had received sufficient information. They had received 41,216 compliance vessels, dispatched at the margin ratios that 411 campaigns had established as sufficient, and they had processed every one of them through 12 dispersed engagement positions, across a corridor approach network that our survey had classified as empty. They understood what the compliance directive represented. Sending it again would not change their understanding. It would tell them that the Pale Dominion had not yet drawn the conclusion that the campaign was over. I was not willing to tell them that. I was not willing to spend one additional transmission on the pretense that there was a 48th Fleet waiting behind this assessment. I closed the display. I filed the compliance report. I typed campaign suspended in the outcome field and wrote the narrative that I described earlier. I transmitted the report. I countersigned the restraint order that the Strategic Compliance Command Tier issued the following day. The campaign had been open for 833 hours. From initiation to formal closure, the Pale Dominion had committed 41,216 vessels. 6,914 had been recalled successfully. The 8 compliant species fleets. The remainder had not reported after contact confirmation. The border corridor hull had been in that position. The same position. No active power signature. No response to hailing. For 749 hours from the first contact confirmation to the final courier. Scan. Through 39 compliance fleet transits. Through whatever it had done to those fleets. Through the courier visits that followed. It remained in that position, to the best of the Pale Dominion's current knowledge, because we have not sent additional couriers, and we have not conducted additional survey sweeps of the corridor, and we have not done anything that might plausibly be interpreted as preparatory to a 48th compliance action. We do not know if it is still there. We do not know what it does when nothing is transiting the corridor. We do not know whether it communicates with the other 11 classified hulls in the approach network, or whether those hulls are still in their survey-recorded positions, or whether the hull count of 12 is accurate, or if it was always a lower bound on a number we did not correctly estimate. We do not know. This is what I mean when I say the compliance doctrine cannot calculate around it. The doctrine requires inputs. The inputs require a survey architecture that can see what it is surveying. Ours cannot see what it is surveying in the human approach corridor, and we have no path to correcting this that does not involve sending additional vessels into a zone where something waits that we cannot categorize. I have been asked, by the younger officers, whether the Pale Dominion will eventually try again. They ask this carefully, because they know I was the officer who issued the ultimatum, and they know what the campaign produced, and they are not sure how I feel about the question. I answer it the same way every time. Not in my lifetime. Not because the Strategic Compliance Command Tier has lost its nerve. Not because 41,000 vessels is a loss we cannot absorb. The Pale Dominion's construction capacity can replace 41,000 vessels given time, and we have replaced fleet losses before, in the 411 earlier campaigns, where attrition was a cost of compliance rather than the outcome. Not because the human species has done anything threatening to Pale Dominion interests beyond the corridor, or because the 8 compliant species that the campaign successfully processed have destabilized. None of these are the reason. The reason is that we do not know how many hulls there are. This is the only reason that matters. Everything else is secondary. We cannot send a fleet into a volume of space where the threat presentation is indistinguishable from the absence of threat. We cannot calibrate a margin against an enemy whose disposition our instruments cannot read. We cannot write a compliance directive for a species whose warships look, to our survey architecture, like nothing. The border corridor hull is 36 kilometers long. Our pre-campaign survey classified it as a derelict. Our post-campaign courier scan showed hull integrity above 90%, engine core temperature consistent with recent operation, and a weapons array configuration that does not appear in any documentation in the Pale Dominion's archive. There are 11 additional classified objects in the approach network. We know about 12. We do not know if 12 is the number. I wrote the ultimatum myself. I have read it 700 times since the campaign closed looking for the error. The logic is sound. The margin calculations are accurate. The fleet sizes were within the doctrine's established parameters for a species of the human military profile. The compliance directive was correctly formatted and appropriately transmitted. The campaign was correctly planned and correctly executed by every standard the Pale Dominion's doctrine provides. The doctrine does not have a standard for a warship that looks like nothing. I have not written another compliance directive since the campaign closed. There are other campaigns in the Strategic Compliance Command Tiers queue, other species, other approach envelopes, other margin calculations to run and fleet sizes to determine and contact confirmation windows to set. I have continued to sign them. I have not written the original documents. I have other officers for that, and they are capable, and the other campaigns proceed normally. The doctrine works. 411 out of 412. The exception is exceptional. But when I stand in the command tier and the displays are up, and the contact confirmation transmissions are coming in on schedule, I sometimes look at the approach vector display, and I think about what it would look like to see an object in a transit corridor that registered as nothing on the scanner, a dead hull, a derelict, insufficient threat, non-functional, and I think how many? The hull in the corridor is still out there. The courier scans confirmed it was not a derelict. The restraint order ensures we will not send another vessel into that corridor to find out whether it has moved, or whether it is still sitting in the same position it occupied when our survey classified it as harmless. Waiting in the way a thing waits when it has already done what it needed to do and has nowhere else to be. I do not know what it is waiting for. I know what it is not waiting for. It is not waiting for a 48th compliance fleet. Because there will not be a 48th compliance fleet. Because the Strategic Compliance Command Tier of the Pale Dominion has suspended this campaign permanently by my countersignature and my recommendation, and the cold arithmetic of 34,000 ships that went into the corridor, and the hull that is still sitting there, showing no active power signature, presenting as what our survey said it was, which is to say, presenting as nothing at all. The campaign is closed. The hull remains. I know which of those two facts will outlast the other, and it is not the one I wrote.